Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and today I want to tell you another story from my book Tales of Olde Sussex by Phillip Mercer, published in 1834. And I'm going to refer to some notes which I have here, just because it's easier than the old-fashioned language in the book. So I hope you don't mind. So I will occasionally be looking down and just referring to them. So Tales of Olde Sussex, which as I say is published in 1834, 200 odd years ago, offers strange and unusual stories. Most of these are from the 18th century, collected by the author when he was a curate, working for a number of churches in Sussex over a 10-year period. Now, many of these accounts are anecdotal, a lot of them are hearsay, handed down generation to generation, probably embellished over time. So it's difficult to know, of course, if there's much truth in them, whether they're genuine, but they do make good yarns. So we're going to take the example of the local magistrate who was buried alive. His name is Reginald Stonefield. He is a 60-year-old keeper of the peace, or rather he was, and he lived at or near Ringmere, it seems, in East Sussex. He seems to have been a minor landowner, had some form of legal practice up in the city and had come down to Sussex to retire. Now, during the 17th and 18th century, smuggling was rife. We all know that. Sussex, obviously being a coastal county, was responsible for a lot of the illicit contraband which was coming inland. A lot came through the Cuckmere Valley, near the Seven Sisters, and not a small amount up through the route through Lewes and Newhaven on the River Ouse. Many a vicar, a rector, a parson, a member of parliament, a squire, or some such important person publicly took a very dim view on all of this. Privately, they turned a blind eye to it. Now, of course, that blind eye may well have come from the fact that, unsurprisingly, a small barrel of brandy or a bag of tea or even a wrap of lace would miraculously appear at their back door, in a barn or in their parlour. So quite easy for them to turn a blind eye. And our Reginald Stonefield was no exception. And actually, we can sort of imagine him, can't we, talking to the rector over copious amounts of duty-free tea, or of an evening swilling his tax-free brandy in one of those large bell glasses. Well, all this was going to change very soon. Dramatic circumstances is what put an end to these indulgences. For one October evening, and I don't know the year, but sometime in the 18th century, as I say, a skirmish seems to have taken place on the cliff tops of Beachy Head. And a 30-something preventative man is said to have been stabbed and then pushed over the edge of one of the cliffs at such a location. Well, the murdering scoundrels who did this were unhappily shocked to find, unlike what they thought was going to happen, that the tide would wash him away before anyone could discover who it was and what had happened, the body was actually found by a troop of dragoons the following morning. And he was very quickly identified as Thomas Stonefield, the magistrate's son and heir. Well, as you can imagine, this put the cat among the pigeons, and there was a huge gasp in the local community. The smugglers had picked on the wrong man to toss over the cliff. Reginald Stoneface was not only now jerked professionally into a personal hatred with the owlers of the night and their illegal activities and so on, but he was expected by the higher authorities to do more than his duty and find the men who had murdered his son and avenge that murder, but he was given the task of stamping out the smuggling activities in that district once and for all. And it was a task that he was all the more willing to do. He was highly motivated. A lot of finger pointing went on. Names were exchanged. Raids were carried out. People arrested and those accused slung in jail. But the justice for the murder failed. Nobody could tell or identify who had killed the magistrate's son. However, things were hotting up for the gang of smugglers who had done it. The two principal ringleaders, whose names unfortunately are not actually mentioned in Tales of Olde Sussex, were getting worried. Their network was beginning to break up. Their contacts no longer saw them as a reliable source. Their fancy revenue stream started to dry up. So something had to be done before Old Stonefield had those two men dangling at the end of a rope. It was towards the end of November, when the evenings were darker and longer. There was a banging at the door on Reginald Stonefield's house. And you can imagine late at night, he was very reluctant to go and answer it, but it was an incessant knocking. He probably came down those stairs in his nightgown with a candle and asked who it was, reluctant, as I say, to open that door, but somehow he was coaxed to do so. Possibly there was a voice on the other side saying that there was a witness who was prepared to name who it was who had murdered his son. And it seems that he did go willingly to, or with, the men who were at the door. And he was taken to a barn about a mile away from his house, presumably to meet somebody, to someone who was going to talk. But it turns out actually nothing of the sort happened. He was brutally beaten up and knocked unconscious. They say he was not dead. That was very important. He was then wrapped in a blanket and dumped in a grave that had already been dug for him, premeditated. The earth then was positioned over the top and filled in. He was buried alive. Later that night, the two men who had done this decided they better go back, and they set fire to his house. And the story went round that the poor magistrate was engulfed in flames and died that way. His body was never found, but the place had razed to the ground and there was no chance of finding him. And of course, they didn't have forensics in those days. So the two then smugglers lay low for a while until the new year, and slowly, after the heat, quite literally, had died down, their life started to get back to normal. They began to re-establish their contacts overseas, and some small-scale manoeuvres started to take place again at night. Nothing big, nothing fancy. And then, down the Chinese whispers chain of information that filtered along, it was learned that a consignment of gold was going to be transferred from London overseas. It was going to be brought down by coach with an escort transferred to a barge on the River Ouse, and that barge was going to come down to Newhaven, transferred once more into a fishing vessel, and then taken to France. And it was believed that this was a private sale, or the money or the gold was going to be used for a private sale for some art. Well, when the two smugglers got to hear of this, this was too good an opportunity to miss. Gold coming down on the River Ouse. It was also a too good an opportunity to share with their normal, everyday countrymen who they would work with in the night. This was going to be their own private endeavour. Now, neither of the smugglers could actually swim, which is why they mainly dealt with the land stuff, and it had been, all the other stuff had been brought in by the sea, by sea smugglers, and often that was the case, two separate different people. And they weren't too feared by the River Ouse, besides which they knew of a bridge just north of Lewes, in which the barge would have to come under, and they knew that at the right moment they could alight the wall over the bridge and get onto the barge quite easily, and then therefore get the gold. On the night in question, they tracked the barge as it came down, the horse pulling the barge down river, and at the appropriate moment they rode ahead, tied up their horses and hid on top of the bridge by the parapet wall. And then, as the barge went underneath, they leapt over the wall and onto the barge. Now, when they landed, to their astonishment, ready with coshes and fisticuffs, the barge was skipperless. Not only that, there was no horse pulling the barge, it just floated. Having got onto the boat, they thought, well, okay, we're not going to waste time, and they immediately went to task to look for the gold. There was a huge tarpaulin which they crept underneath to see if the gold in a box of some description was on it. To their amazement and to their shock, suddenly a hidden lantern that was now lit suddenly emerged, and two men came out of the gloom. One of them, to their horror, was Reginald Stonefield. Well, there was another man, but it's not said who that was. They were somewhat astonished by this and stood back in shock. Now, to them, it meant going further back into the boat. Unfortunately for them, the bottom of the boat was incredibly rotten. This barge was, in a terrible state, and it seems that they fell through. There is another telling in a paragraph later on that it says that actually what happened is, in their shock at seeing Reginald Stonefield, they stepped backwards, slipped, and the tarpaulin came with them, and they both went down immersed in that. Whichever way it was, both of them ended up in the drink and they couldn't swim. And it seems that their bodies were washed down past Lewes and came out at Newhaven the following morning. One of them had died, had perished. The other was almost dead. And he was taken to somewhere, and he related what he had seen, which is how the story obviously got told. And yet, whatever happened to the barge and those two men, particularly the one that they said was Reginald Stonefield, history has no knowledge. For Phillip Mercer, in his book Tales of Olde Sussex, says that it doesn't come back up at all. It's not even heard of. Except that he also ponders, the strange thing is that the grave of Reginald Stonefield has never been found. It is yet to be found. And he asks, if and when it is there a body at the bottom of it? Makes you think, doesn't it? Well, I hope you've enjoyed that little tale. If you'd like to hear more of these tales of Old Sussex, then do let me know. Leave a comment. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe, follow, like, all those things. You can, of course, become a patron and help me make these videos with a small donation. Buy me a cup of coffee if you enjoyed the story. Why not? And I will endeavour to either tell you another story on another occasion or get out and do some more exploring. In the meantime, thanks for watching. It's been fun, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.